Just 2 days ago, the political world lost one of its most recognizable and most consistent voices. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina died suddenly on the night of July 11, 2026, at the age of 71, after what his office described as a brief and sudden illness. For a man who spent more than 3 decades in the halls of Congress, who outlasted political storms, party realignments, and countless news cycles, the end came almost without warning. Just hours earlier, he had returned from an overseas trip focused on the war in Ukraine. Hours before that, he had spoken with President Trump on the phone, a conversation the president later said seemed entirely ordinary. Nobody around him saw this coming. So who was the man behind the headlines? And how did a boy from a small mill town in South Carolina become one of the most influential senators of his generation? That's the story worth telling today. Lindsey Olin Graham was born on July 9, 1955, in central South Carolina, a small town where his parents ran a restaurant, bar, and pool hall that doubled as the family's entire livelihood. He grew up working alongside his parents in that business, learning early what it meant to put in long hours for very little. His was not a household built on privilege or connections. It was a working-class upbringing in the truest sense, the kind of environment where every dollar mattered and every family member pitched in. Graham often spoke about how formative those years were, describing his path to the Senate as one that started behind a pool hall counter rather than in any kind of political dynasty. That ordinary childhood was interrupted by tragedy while Graham was still in college. Within about 15 months of each other, both of his parents died, leaving him, still a young man, responsible for his younger sister Darlene, who was 9 years his junior. Graham didn't just help raise her informally. He eventually became her legal guardian, taking on a parental role while he was still working to finish his own education. It's the kind of responsibility that reshapes a person's outlook permanently, and those who knew Graham throughout his life often pointed back to that period as the moment his sense of duty and responsibility was forged. He would go on to become the first member of his family to attend college, earning both his bachelor's degree and his law degree from the University of South Carolina. After finishing law school in 1981, Graham didn't head straight into politics or into a comfortable private law practice. He joined the United States Air Force, commissioned as an officer in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, commonly known as the JAG Corps. His work as a military lawyer took him overseas, where he served at Rhein-Main Air Base in Germany from 1984 to 1988, at one point serving as the Air Force's chief prosecutor in Europe. During that stretch, he even gained a bit of national attention when he was featured in a segment defending an airman in a case that exposed flaws in the military's drug testing procedures. After leaving active duty in 1989, Graham didn't step away from military life altogether. He joined the South Carolina Air National Guard and was called back into active service during the Gulf War in the early 1990s, helping brief departing pilots on the laws of war. He continued serving in the Air Force Reserve for years afterward, eventually reaching the rank of colonel, and didn't formally retire from military service until 2015, capping off more than 3 decades in uniform alongside his political career. Those who worked closely with him often said his connection to the military never really faded, even decades into his time in the Senate, and colleagues later noted that his identity as an Air Force officer remained one of the things he was proudest of. Graham's entry into politics began modestly, with a single term in the South Carolina House of Representatives starting in 1992. 2 years later, when longtime Democratic Congressman Butler Derrick announced his retirement from South Carolina's 3rd Congressional District, Graham ran to succeed him. With the backing of longtime South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond, Graham won his primary and then went on to defeat his Democratic opponent, becoming the first Republican to represent that district since the 1870s. It was part of a broader wave that year, one that reshaped Congress and brought a new generation of conservative lawmakers to Washington. Graham spent 8 years in the House, and it was during this period that he gained national attention as one of the House managers during the impeachment proceedings against President Bill Clinton, a role that put him in front of television cameras and helped establish him as a rising figure within the Republican Party. In 2002, Graham made the jump to the Senate, winning the seat vacated by the retiring Strom Thurmond, the same senator who had helped launch his career years earlier. He would go on to be re-elected in 2008, 2014, and 2020, building a Senate career that spanned nearly a quarter century. Over those years, Graham became known for his work across several major committees, eventually chairing the Senate Judiciary Committee from 2019 to 2021, and later taking over as chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. He built a reputation as one of the chamber's most outspoken voices on defense and foreign policy, consistently pushing for a strong American presence on the world stage. He was often described as a foreign policy hawk, someone who believed firmly that American power needed to be used proactively rather than reactively, and he rarely shied away from advocating for military engagement when he believed the situation called for it. One of the defining friendships of Graham's political life was his relationship with the late Senator John McCain of Arizona. Alongside Senator Joe Lieberman of Connecticut, the three of them became known informally as the Three Amigos, a nickname that stuck because of how often they traveled together and how closely aligned their views were on foreign policy and national security. Graham and McCain in particular developed an especially close bond, one that went beyond mere political alliance, and Graham often spoke in later years about how deeply that friendship had shaped his worldview. Their shared belief in an engaged American foreign policy carried through decades of debates over wars, alliances, and defense spending, and Graham continued to champion many of the same positions long after McCain's death in 2018. Graham's relationship with Donald Trump followed a much different arc, and it became one of the more closely watched political transformations in recent memory. During the 2016 Republican presidential primary, Graham was himself a candidate, though he dropped out before the primary voting even began. At the time, he was one of Trump's sharper critics, going so far as to publicly criticize him during that campaign season. Yet after Trump won the presidency and the two men met directly in 2017, something shifted. Graham became one of Trump's closest allies in the Senate, someone the former president would later describe warmly in tributes following Graham's death. Over the following years, Graham was often characterized as a trusted advisor on foreign policy matters, someone Trump would consult on issues ranging from Ukraine to the Middle East. That evolution from critic to close ally was one of the more notable political shifts of the past decade, and it says something about how Graham approached politics. Less about rigid ideological consistency and more about finding where he believed he could have influence and make an impact. Throughout his time in the Senate, Graham remained one of the most consistent advocates for supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia, a position he held across both the Trump and Biden administrations. He also remained one of the loudest voices calling for a firm stance against Iran, and he was a steadfast supporter of Israel and the broader U.S.-Israel relationship throughout his career, a position that placed him at the center of debates during periods of heightened tension in the Middle East. In fact, in the days immediately before his death, Graham had just returned from an overseas trip tied to these very issues, having attended a NATO summit in Turkey and reportedly working behind the scenes with fellow senators on strategy related to ending the war in Ukraine. Colleagues who were present described him as fully engaged, working the room at diplomatic functions in the way he had for years, showing no outward signs that anything was wrong. Graham's final hours reportedly unfolded quickly and without warning. According to reporting from major outlets, emergency responders were called to his home on Capitol Hill on the night of July 11th after reports of a medical emergency. Paramedics performed CPR at the scene before he was taken to the hospital, where he later passed away. Preliminary findings from the District of Columbia Medical Examiner's Office indicated the cause of death was related to an aortic dissection tied to underlying heart disease. Staff members who worked closely with him said there had been no indication in the days beforehand that he wasn't feeling well, and President Trump, who spoke with Graham by phone just hours before his death, said the senator seemed tired but otherwise fine during their conversation. The news of Graham's death sent a wave of tributes across the political spectrum, a reflection of just how many relationships he had built over more than 3 decades in Washington. President Trump posted a tribute online, calling Graham one of the greatest people and senators he had ever known and describing him as a true American patriot, and he ordered flags at federal buildings to be flown at half-staff in his memory. Senate Majority Leader John Thune praised Graham as a strong advocate for the United States and a reliable ally to freedom-loving nations around the world, noting that numerous world leaders had relied on his counsel over the years. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster called him irreplaceable, saying the state and the country would not see another figure quite like him. Even outside the United States, tributes poured in, including from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who credited Graham as one of Israel's greatest friends in the U.S. Senate. Democratic senators who often clashed with Graham on policy also offered warm remembrances, describing him as someone who could be a fierce partisan one day and a genuine bipartisan collaborator the next, a rare quality in an increasingly polarized political environment. Graham's death also arrives at a particularly sensitive moment for the Senate itself. He was serving as chairman of the Senate Budget Committee and had recently announced plans to seek a fifth six-year term representing South Carolina in this year's elections, having already secured a formal endorsement from President Trump and reported strong early fundraising numbers for his campaign. His sudden passing leaves a vacancy that will need to be addressed both politically and procedurally, at a time when the chamber's Republican majority was already considered narrow. Beyond the practical questions of succession, though, many of his colleagues have emphasized what they see as a larger loss: the departure of a senator who had built relationships and institutional knowledge over more than 2 decades, someone who had been present for major turning points in modern American foreign policy debates, from the Iraq War era through the war in Ukraine and tensions with Iran. Away from the political stage, those who knew Graham personally often described him as someone whose life had been shaped early by responsibility and duty, first through the loss of his parents and the role he took on raising his sister, and later through his decades of military service. He never married and did not have children of his own, and in interviews and his own writing over the years, he described his path as one where the demands of public life and his sense of obligation to serve simply took precedence. His closest living relative is his sister, Darlene Graham Dunn, the same sister he helped raise decades earlier as a young man navigating the sudden loss of both parents. That early chapter of his life, marked by hardship and responsibility far beyond his years, is one that colleagues and biographers have often pointed to as foundational to understanding the sense of duty that defined the rest of his career. Looking back at the arc of Lindsey Graham's life, what stands out is not any single moment but the sheer consistency of his presence across more than 3 decades of American political life. From a childhood spent working in his family's small-town restaurant, to years spent as a military lawyer stationed overseas, to decades navigating the shifting currents of Washington politics, Graham's career reflected a steady, often unglamorous kind of public service. He wasn't universally beloved, and his political shifts over the years drew plenty of criticism from various directions, but even his critics tended to acknowledge the depth of his experience and his genuine commitment to the issues he cared about most, particularly on matters of national security and foreign policy. His sudden death, arriving without warning just as he was preparing for another re-election campaign and immediately after representing the United States on the world stage in Turkey, has left colleagues, constituents, and observers across the political spectrum processing the loss of someone who had simply always been there, a fixture of the Senate for a generation. As tributes continue to come in from world leaders, colleagues, and everyday South Carolinians who watched him represent their state for over 20 years, the through line in nearly all of them is the same. A man shaped early by hardship, who built a life around service, whether in uniform, in the courtroom, or on the Senate floor, and who kept working right up until the very end. What are your thoughts on Senator Graham's legacy and the impact he had on American politics? Share your reflections in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more coverage of the stories shaping our world today.